Hi, I'm Terry Kolath, and we've reached session 3 on the history of England with Professor Adrian Kerr, and let's see what we're going to have in the class this time, Adrian.
Thank you, Terry. When we left the second class, William the Conqueror had just taken over the country. All land belonged to him. His new chief executive style meant there was a single government now running England. Before that, the Anglo-Saxons did have unified rulers for about 150 years. So England's monarchy as a unified monarchy goes back to around the middle of the 9th century. But it was William the Conqueror who crystallized the control, central government, taxation, the Doomsday Book, which is a taxation device. And the kings after him began to have a stranglehold not only on England and parts of Wales and Scotland, but also a lot of property in France. France at that time was a small area of land around Paris. And the King of France looked after a very small part of what is now modern-day France. And due to Henry II, successor to William, he married Eleanor of Aquitaine. And so effectively England and the west part of what is now France today was under a unified ruler of Henry II. Wow. He was a very tough, strong king and had a very famous wife, in which there have been books and movies made about him. He also had a very famous son, and it was Richard Lionheart, who spent a lot of his time fighting both in the Crusades against Saladin and also in France, constant warfare with his enemies in France. He died young, and so his brother, who wasn't prepared, was called John, and he's given the name Bad King John, so you know this is not going to end well. And the barons now had completely got fed up with Henry II and Richard Lionheart extracting taxes for foreign wars, and when John tried to do the same, they'd said enough. And so in 1215, they forced him to come to a little island in the Thames called Runnymede, and he had to sign the Magna Carta, which gave the barons, the nobles, some element of control over the king. He reneged on that thereafter, but he died fleeing the nobles. And from then onwards, there was a beginning of a balance between the people, the nobles, and the king. And so from then onwards, there's the beginning of what's going to become a parliament system, but still early days. The next king who became very important in English history was Edward I. He was very tall, 6'2", which is very tall at the time. He was given the name Longshanks because he was so tall. And he pulverized the Welsh, and really it's from his time onwards that Wales became integrated permanently into England. And then he set about the Scots, and there were wars in Scotland, and of course the most famous wars were Bannockburn and Robert the Bruce became William Wallace before that. So this is the famous period of inter-Scottish English warfare, and Robert the Bruce managed to keep the Brits out effectively after Edward I died. We then move on to a very interesting Shakespearean period of English history, which is characterized by a number of wars between England and their diminishing domains in France. France was getting stronger and pushing gradually the English provinces out. So you see famous battles that Shakespeare talks about. We have Henry V at Agincourt, and then the Battle of Crécy, where the English, horribly outnumbered by the French knights with armor, fought them off with bows and arrows, and we're doing a pretty good job at hanging onto the territory, but the die was cast. England was no longer dominant enough to keep the French at bay, and of course eventually all of the French colonies were taken by France itself. Then England went into an internal civil war. We call it the War of the Roses. The king was remaining the king throughout, but he was very dependent on wealthy noblemen. And there were famous people like Warwick, who was called the Kingmaker, because he was strong enough and wealthy enough to actually influence who was to be the next king. And the Wars of the Roses are famously between the two houses of Lancaster and York, White and Red Roses, which Shakespeare has written about extensively. And that led to a change in dynasty. And the change in dynasty was the Tudors. The Tudors arrived. Of course, all school kids remember the Tudors and the Stuarts. That's the beginning of their remembrance of English history. And this is the beginning of England now becoming a dominant power. And of course, the person who we focus on towards the end of this talk is Henry VIII, who started off as a very popular young man who was a great a duelist and toured the country. People loved him. He was handsome, tall, and used to visit all the villages and towns. He was very popular. but he went astray. He had married a Catholic queen, but she couldn't produce an heir. And in those days, it was critical for the dynasty to continue to have a male heir, and she wasn't able to. She produced a daughter, Mary, who had become a Catholic queen, but he wanted an heir, and so he went to in those days, you go to the Pope and ask them to nullify the marriage, and the Pope wouldn't do that. So Henry VIII took the opportunity to kill two birds with one stone. He created the Church of England and no longer had an influence from the Pope. And secondly, he got his hands on the monasteries, which were very, very wealthy landowners and monastery owners. And he dissolved the monasteries with the various political leaders, of which William Shakespeare writes a lot about that subject too. Sure. But of course, Henry VIII becomes famous in the world's eye because of the 6 wives, one of whom actually survived him. One produced another female, Elizabeth, who was going to go on to take over from him. And England now, at his death, becomes a Protestant country. And that's important because for the next 50, 80 years thereafter, we'll talk about the next session, that wasn't a done deal. There were still a lot of Catholic people in England who didn't like this idea.
Oh, I bet. Well, it gets more and more exciting. That's session 3, and we hope you'll join us.